Another edition of Eye on the Issues. Today we are talking about the Wyoming legislative session. It's kicked off on Monday. Things are going right now. We're going to talk about one measure in a second, but right now I want to welcome in State Senator Dan Laursen, Senate District 19. And I also want to welcome in a Wyoming citizen, Bill Tallen. He's got a law enforcement background. He's got a lot to add to this conversation. Dan, let's talk about this session. What does it mean? What kind of session is it?
Thank you, Mike. It's a budget session. It lasts 20 working days. I'll be down here for a month, but we'll be finished. I think it's March 8th, I'm pretty sure, on a Friday. So it's quick. The main focus is the budget. And so all other bills, even committee bills that we've been working on interim during the summer, take a 2/3 vote to get them into a committee. And that's what we did today. We went over, 54 bills or something real fast, kind of on a consent list. Sometimes you pull some off and they described them, but today we didn't have that happen. And they were all committee bills. But we went through them really fast. We got them sent out to committees in the morning and then tomorrow at lunch. So we might be able to start committee of the whole on some bills tomorrow afternoon. So it goes really fast.
And so from what happens is that the bills go to committee, they get voted on in committee. If they make it out of committee, then they come to the full Senate.
Yep, Mike, that is correct. So the big deal is it takes a 2/3 majority to get it sent to a committee. And then after that, it's just the usual process. The budget bill is automatically going to be brought up, I think, on Thursday, I think. So they'll introduce it and describe it.
Fantastic. All right. And Bill, let's bring you into the conversation here. Why are you interested in this legislative session?
Well, Mike, I spent approximately 30 years in federal law enforcement. And at the beginning of that period, as an entirely separate endeavor, I was recruited into the New Mexico State Defense Force, which was essentially the state guard organization in New Mexico, for a special mission set. And that was my introduction to the entire concept. And at the time, received an officer's commission from the state of New Mexico and began to learn a little bit about the historical and the statutory authority for these state guard or state defense force organizations. So I've been familiar with that for several decades. And then later on in my career, I was attending the master's program at the U.S. Naval War College and did a great deal of research on federal, state, and local agencies and forces and their responsiveness in emergency situations. And that led to some more research on this topic. And since I've been here in Wyoming for going on 12 years now, I've become familiar with the statutes and the statutory authority for standing up a force like that here in Wyoming, and came up in conversation between myself and Dan and a few other folks, and we looked at those statutes and saw that they needed some updating and some clarifying, and I think that's what Dan's bill is attempting to do.
Gotcha. Great. Okay, so Dan, let's talk about your bill. It's SF106, and it is called the Wyoming State Guard Amendment. Tell us about that.
That is correct, Mike. Thank you. And I do want to recognize Bill. He's been kind of the pusher. And like he said, we got together, a group of us, a month or two ago, and we were discussing some possible bills. And this was a good topic that I thought, and the group thought that it might help Wyoming. So that's the whole idea. Currently in statutes, there's a specific statute, 19, I think 9, that deals directly with the National Guard. And so we have the Wyoming National Guard. And then we have another statute that deals with Wyoming State Guard. And currently in the statute, the governor can't do a whole lot unless he gets federal permission, kind of is what it says in the statutes currently. And so we just want to make another tool in the toolbox for the governor if he wants to do it. and we could set up a state guard. And if he so desires to do that, he would appoint a council of defense, and I mean the statute's pretty clear on what how to go about it. But the main thing was we'd need I don't know if it was permission from the federal government, but in federal law they don't want anything to do with state guards, so it's best just to get them out. So hopefully that kind of helps.
Talk about what do you envision the governor using the state guard for?
Well, what came up it actually says in the new parts of the bill, it would be if the governor so desired to put this together, it would be to preserve the public peace, to execute the laws of the state, to suppress insurrection and repel invasion. And those wordings actually are coming out of our Constitution currently. Article 17, Section 5 use those exact words. And it's in our Constitution too to do this. What I see happening is, maybe over the next, I don't know, year or two, if it was actually the governor said he wanted to do it, they'd have obviously training and all that. Bill, I'm sure, can go into this a lot more detail than I can, but the big thing was maybe use it for our local law enforcement. If the National Guard is busy or out of state and they don't have that many up, say like in my county, in Park County, maybe this group could help law enforcement on any issues, maybe fire, big fire. They could go out and be sent out to help with whatever's needed, somebody to direct traffic or whatever. So that's kind of just to have manpower.
Sure. So Bill, before you get into your what you can add to this conversation, I'm curious, what year did you get involved in New Mexico in terms of the
that was in 1989.
Okay.
And
Gotcha.
and it was a short-lived engagement because the mission that the state wanted to organize that force for kind of fell apart before we became operational, but we became we're very involved in recruiting and in designing training plans and talking about how to execute this with a state-controlled volunteer force. And it was a very good dry run, even though it didn't result in an operational capability at that time.
Right. Interesting. So talk about moving that whole concept to Wyoming, and how do you see this playing out in the state of Wyoming?
Well, it's really, I mean, Dan touched on most of the key points. What it boils down to is this: back in the early 20th century, when the National Guard was created out of the state militias that had existed since independence, the National Guard was an attempt to standardize those forces and place them on an equal footing in terms of organization and status and capabilities and training, along with the federal military. State governors in 1917 noticed that immediately, this was just a few years after the National Guard had really been organized, that the entire National Guard of the United States was mobilized for the First World War. 300,000 approximately National Guardsmen were all activated into federal service and shipped over to France for the duration of the war. And the governors said there were a whole lot of things that the traditional state militias, and now the National Guard, do for the states, aside from being called up into federal service. They assist in relief and recovery and support for in natural disasters, protection of life and property under all kinds of circumstances, search and rescue, support to civil authorities, civil unrest, all those kinds of things. And when the National Guard, in whole or in part, is mobilized and sent off in federal service, who in the state can pick up that slack? And the federal government agreed with that and said, that's exactly right. And therefore, we, the federal government, authorize you states to organize state guards that cannot be activated into federal service. And therefore, they're going to be at your disposal within the state for all of these roles that may arise. And so they've been a fact of life, in the country since about 1918. Most states have these statutes on the book. Majority of states have actually mobilized them in the First World War and the Second World War. And then very, very pivotally, in the 1980s, the original requirement that said the state guard forces could only be mobilized if the National Guard were taken away from the state, that was removed. And the governors now have the authority to raise their state guard as a permanent standing state military force, regardless of the status of the National Guard. And so what I think we're looking at is we'd like the governor to have the authority at his discretion to organize that force and then use it for all of those state missions that the National Guard currently employs. But in Wyoming, the total manpower of the National Guard is somewhere around 3,000 people. And as we know, over the last 20 some years, a fair number of those folks have been deployed on a rotational basis overseas. And so should the need arise for trained manpower under discipline, under orders, to perform those kinds of missions within the state, and the National Guard is otherwise occupied, this would be a pool of trained manpower in order to assist or back up or supplement the National Guard in doing those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And that's what Dan is trying to do here really is just lay the groundwork where the governor could assemble that council, organize that force, stand it up in advance of the need. It would seem like a reasonable way to approach it. Sure. But it's going to be, this doesn't create that force. This just clarifies the statutes that would allow the governor to do that if he chose.
Gotcha. And so if the National Guard is, as you said, 3,000 strong for the state of Wyoming, for example, Dan, what do you envision in terms of the state guard? What kind of numbers and any ballpark idea of what it would cost to kick this off?
This is kind of where I need a little help from Mike too. But in our discussions, we were kind of thinking maybe in each county there might be 125 guys maybe that would volunteer for this, and our whole concept is it would be volunteer. This isn't going to need to be a big expense to the state. I think there's volunteers out there that would step up. Even at the level of the officers needed and such, you need every level of it, and especially at the lower levels, you need young guys, obviously. But I don't think it would cost that much. We got a fiscal note from the governor's office that I'm going to go discuss a little bit with them, but it was a lot, and the intent was not what they think it is. Mm-hmm. So I need to go visit with them. I do want to clarify that in this current statutes, there is a section in there that we can't form the state guard, like Bill had mentioned. That was changed in the federal law in 1983 or whatever I think he mentioned, but it's still in our statutes that they couldn't be organized unless the National Guard was deployed. So we want to clarify that we could start.
And Bill, let's now that many people are considering every state a border state, Bill, if we can, let's talk. What is your perception as to what's going on in, for example, the state of Texas with the what I would call open border down there, and how Texas Governor Greg Abbott is trying to handle that from a law enforcement standpoint?
Without wading into the political debate around that, what I see happening down there in Texas that kind of sort of bears on this discussion is that Governor Abbott is in fact deploying the Texas National Guard under state authority, which every state can do, in order to assist with affairs down on the border and trying to establish some order down there. My experience that I mentioned back in the 1980s in New Mexico was actually related to that, because the mission that we were slated to perform arose from the fact that at that time the New Mexico National Guard was rotating personnel down to the Mexican border in direct support of the United States Border Patrol. They were manning observation posts along the border just to provide observation and support to the Border Patrol. And the cost of doing that with National Guard forces was becoming kind of prohibitive to the state. And so they were looking at their state guard or state defense force as a volunteer organization that could step in and assume some of that load at a lower cost to the state. And so that, I think, is an example. there's been discussion, and we don't know how this is going to shake out. But if Governor Abbott in Texas currently, or any governor of any state, mobilizes all or part of his National Guard to perform any kind of legitimate role within his state, he's subject to those guardsmen being taken away and activated into federal service and sent off to an overseas war or to any other federal mission. And what we're concerned with is we wouldn't want to see the state and the governor of Wyoming left high and dry with his manpower pulled away in case there were requirements that required additional manpower. And that the purpose of these organizations, and we can look around the country and we see these templates. So it's not like this hasn't been done. There are about 22 states right now that have active state guard organizations. And so we can go back through decades and see how they're organized, how they're run. And like Dan said, it's generally a very, very cost efficient deal. They're primarily volunteer organizations. The organization, administration, training, that's all volunteer service. It doesn't cost the state a penny. If they're activated and called up to work and perform a specific mission for the state, the Wyoming statutes say at that time and for that period, they'll be paid at the same pay rate that National Guard troops would be, but only during the period that they're actually activated under orders from the governor. So, and the rest of the time, they would simply be a standing force, essentially in standby mode, and maintaining their status and their training and their abilities purely in volunteer mode.
Dan, almost like a backup plan, really. Is that what this is?
Oh, sorry. Yes, that is correct, Mike. Yeah, just a backup plan. If and even with the guns or whatever is needed or such, the volunteers could bring their guns, and they would have to meet certain specifications that the Council of Defense had decided was needed, and the governor's the first one that would decide it was even set up. And then from there, his ability would be to get a Council of Defense started. I don't know how he would go about that. It's his choice. And from there, then how you go about facilitating the plan it's in his hands. It isn't like the legislature is going to tie him down to anything. It's kind of the way I envision it. It's a tool in his toolbox if he so desires, and I think it would be a good idea if he started thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. And so for people in Wyoming that see this and are supportive of this idea, is there anything they can do in the next couple days or week or two to show their support? Can they call the governor's office? Can they call other lawmakers and say, hey, I like this idea? What can they do?
I think the best thing would be maybe contact your senators at this time. I know some are wobbly on a cost. The intent is not, we need to visit with the governor and make sure what the statute says. I don't even know if he's read them. He might have now that he knows something's out there. But yeah, I'd say call your senator, because that might be a vote we take. Tomorrow's Tuesday. It could happen Wednesday. I'm not sure what the last day is for this 2/3 vote deal, as I should know. I think that's Friday, but I'm not positive. Mm-hmm. I think our budget first reading's like Thursday, and that takes like all day.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's going to be quick when it comes up.
Gotcha. Okay. And now in respect to anything, I mean, obviously this is an abbreviated legislative session, Dan. Anything else jumping out at you that you're very high on right now?
Yes, thanks, Mike. The biggest deal statewide, and everybody knows it, is property tax. We've got to come out with something with property tax to help out. Mine went up 70% in the last 4 years on my property tax. So I've heard some people say 100% in that time. So the government entities out there that are getting these dollars, I don't think their expenses went up 70%. You expect those to go up a little bit, but they're going to use the money. They're going to say they were short in the past 10 years, so they deserve it. But the whole thing is we need to help the people make sure they can stay in their homes. It's a big deal for the elderly. Quite often I get phone calls about that. Can't pay my property tax. And so if they don't pay them, they go to the county steps and they'll be sold.
Sure. So how did the taxes go up so much? What kind of legislation was passed, or how did that happen?
Our house value just goes up comparable to what the sales are in your surrounding area.
Oh, so it's really based on property value. That's how it's going up. I understand.
Yeah. Yep.
It's not like the rates going up that high.
Nope, you're correct. It's all our houses, according to the government, are worth a lot more. Yeah, they probably are, but I didn't sell mine. It's not worth that until I sell it.
I tell you what, with the mortgage rates they are right now, people that own a house right now are pretty much, they're going to sit tight and ride this little wave out, and hopefully the Biden inflation goes away sometime in the near future. Bill, any final comments?
Well, yeah, let me throw one more thing out there back on this Senate File 106, because I think it helps people to visualize and understand what we're talking about. In several other states, that I've lived and worked in, law enforcement organizations from the state police down through county sheriff's offices and police departments maintain reserve organizations. A sheriff's posse or a police reserve or a state police reserve. I served in one of those for a while. Those aren't very common in New Mexico. Most of our law enforcement agencies don't have reserve organizations. And a lot of them right now are finding that recruiting and retention of officers is becoming rather difficult. A lot of them are shorthanded and having trouble recruiting qualified personnel. And that's under normal conditions. So under any kind of off normal conditions, they could be very, very strapped for manpower. And what we're talking about here with the State Guard would once again be a manpower pool that could be mobilized to support not just the Wyoming National Guard, but state law enforcement and other state agencies at need. And there's our example. I mean, this state is full of volunteer organizations. We have volunteer firefighters in almost every community. We've got the volunteer search and rescue teams in every county. And this would just be another pool of trained, committed personnel volunteering their services to the state in time of need. And I think sooner or later we're going to need that in Wyoming.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if either one of you heard that Christopher Wray, the FBI director, recently spoke to the sheriffs from across the country. And one sheriff came out and gave a real warning that with all of the people coming across the southern border, the FBI director said there are more red flags up right now in the nation than there were right before 9/11. So having another layer of support that people can call on, like the governor, is probably not a bad idea.
I'd have to agree.
Dan, any final comments?
No, that's kind of our take. It would be a good thing if we set something up in Wyoming like this. I think things are in turmoil.
Yeah, this is a lot going on, and the time right now is time to circle the wagons, and doing this is one way of circling the wagons and just kind of protecting your own. Wouldn't you say, Bill?
That sounds like a very, very good way of putting it. Yes, sir.
Okay, so Dan, possibly by the end of the week we'll find out if this is going to get 2/3.
Yeah. I'm guessing it might even be Wednesday. I don't know.
Yeah.
Definitely by the end of the week, we'll know if we got enough to even get it to a committee. Gotcha. Got lucky, or not lucky, but we do have the chairman of the military affairs, and I can't remember. I think it's transportation, but he got on board and is supporting and sees that this could be a good thing for Wyoming.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
I mean, it's in the statutes. Let's fix it so we can use it.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. And if anybody wants to find out more about what's happening around the state of Wyoming, go to yliberty.org. And we're going to have this posted up, gentlemen, so people can see it as soon as possible this week. And hopefully we can discuss this at a future date in a couple of weeks and see how things are playing out. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds really good.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.